The Wart Forest by Austin Mooney. Colin had known Greg long enough to trust the perilous expression of gloom on his face when he emerged from the shadowy tree line. Greg had left the safe confines of their bonfire to relieve himself somewhere away from camp about 15 minutes earlier, and the group was beginning to worry about him. They assumed whatever was keeping him must have been his own private business. They dreaded the idea of checking in on him only to cause embarrassment for both parties. They thought at first that perhaps he was sick, and he would inform them that he needed to go home. Instead, he instructed them to follow him back to the dark forest. There were 4 of them: Greg, Colin, Macklin, and Dane. The men, all now in their middle years, had been friends since childhood, and although they had much different lives now, they still made time to go on a camping retreat together once a year. They tried to pick a new place to go each time. Most of the fun of the experience was hiking and surveying the new land and recapturing the wonder of exploration they felt back in their youth, when such feelings were easier to come by. This year, they decided on a spring visit to a small patch of woods near Lake Michigan, somewhat close to the U.S. and Canadian border. The area existed in a strange in-between place that felt oddly homeless and independent. It didn't feel like it belonged to either country. It was just there. They had arrived later in the day than they anticipated and were deprived of that first chance to venture into the unknown before the necessity of shelter and warmth became paramount in their minds. They quickly unloaded their equipment and followed the short trail to the closest camping area to get as much assistance from the dying sun as it would allow before twilight turned its cold gaze to laugh at their unfinished camp. They were using a single tent, large enough to comfortably house the 4 men. The friends had learned to live together through the sleepovers of their childhood and various roommate living arrangements in their early adulthood. One big tent was all they needed, which made the construction process much more efficient. As soon as it was built, a fire was lit in the pit of the charred remains of previous camping excursions. Greg announced that he needed to use the toilet and that he would be back soon. "If I'm not back in 15 minutes, come looking for me," he said. "I don't have to poop, so it shouldn't take that long. But if I do end up having to poop and then doing it, and you come looking for me, and that's what I'm doing, then I'm sorry, but better safe than sorry." "Just go," said Colin. "Yeah, stop talking," Macklin said. "I'm not going to look for you." Dane laughed as he opened a beer. Greg held a playful middle finger to the group and disappeared beyond the tree line. 15 minutes passed, and the men started to wonder. Was Greg kidding before? Was he playing a joke now? Did he want them to come looking for him? Luckily, he showed his face before that feeling swelled up inside them and reached the point where they felt a need to discuss it. They all knew the others were feeling weird. What was Greg doing out there? A sigh of relief vented through their noses toward the ground and curved up into the sky once he appeared. But the tension was reinvigorated and evolved into a new collection of despair when they saw the look on his face. "What's up, are you okay?" Colin asked. "We were about to come looking for you," Macklin said. "I wasn't," said Dane. "You guys need to come with me," Greg said, his mouth barely moving. His eyes hung sourly in his dull face as his eyelids stretched toward the sky in an act of bodily surrender and panic. The muscles in his clammy visage were communicating emotions that seemed entirely burnt out in his mind. He held both of his hands in his front pockets, as though he was a teacher about to ask a leading question that would carry him into a mind-altering lecture. The chemicals coursing through him were putting on a performance of normalcy that was wholly severed from his thoughts. He looked like he could barely feel any of it, and his body was taking over. "There's something I want to show you," he said. No, Dane whined. We just got the fire going and stuff. Let's chill. What is it? Colin asked, concerned by the confusing mixture of emotions flowing from his friend's body language. I can't describe it, he said. Muscles in his arms twitched as his hands balled into bulging fists in his pocket. But I never seen anything like it before. Is it next to where you peed? Macklin asked. Because maybe it can wait. That's when the fire grew bright enough that Colin and Macklin were able to discern that Greg had urinated in his pants. A gasp of surprise and worry shook through them. His black jeans revealed a section of slightly blacker denim that soaked a vertical puddle through the material surrounding his groin. An energy of silence weighed down on the camp. It's not very far, Greg said, before turning around and dissolving back into the twisting gateway of crepuscle wooded kingdom before them. Colin walked after him, and Macklin followed. Dane finished his beer and opened another beer and grabbed his high-powered flashlight that he normally loved having an excuse to use, and released an annoying sigh and ventured into the woods to find his friends. Colin and Macklin held their phone flashlights up to light the path, but Greg led without one. His hands stayed in his pockets. He simply knew where to go. He dodged low branches and obstacles with memorized, conditioned precision. Everything appeared so calm and easy despite his tainted eyes looking back at his friends every few paces, in urine-soaked clothing telling a drastically different story. The other two tripped and stumbled along behind him as they quietly made their way. Any questions asked to Greg were met with a soft, "We're almost there." Then a clearing opened itself to them, and the starry night sky waterfalled down onto their dusty heads. A brilliant rush of energizing visible light flooded the area, as if the arena of distant worlds around them wished the men to see what was there. In the middle of the clearing was a small stub or stump, perhaps a collection of mushrooms, sitting 3 feet tall and 3 feet wide. It was tan pink, and the shedding of whatever comprised it littered the grass around it. As they approached the specimen, Colin felt a hollow ache in his stomach, like life-threatening hunger pangs, the type of empty bellyache that causes one to vomit whenever pathetic liquid is still contained in them in a misguided attempt to fix the problem. He worried he would be sick, but he couldn't easily find his way back to camp if he retreated. His breathing controlled and heart rate slowing, Colin continued following his friend's relentless, brisk pace toward the stump. Once they reached it, they realized it wasn't a stump, or at least not one by appearance. Perhaps an invasive fungus of some kind had claimed the stump and covered it, the grave of a tree suffocated beneath its new, wormy overcoat. The dome of organic matter was rough, a callous blob of an unappealing texture reminiscent of cauliflower. Every few seconds or so, it would lightly shake as though a bubble had popped below its surface. It was alive, whatever it was. Greg walked over to it, looked back at the men with a smile, and then kicked it. A resounding thud rippled through it like a carnival strongman's abdomen after getting punched in the gut by an audience member. A small chunk of fleshy tumor ripped off with the tip of Greg's shoe and landed next to them. Shortly afterward, the spot that had been ripped regenerated. "I've been picking at this thing since I left camp. That's where all these other pieces of it came from," he said, gesturing to the mess around his feet. "But it just keeps regenerating. It's gross and it hurts. I feel like it has to be hurting the forest. It hurts when I look at it, like its existence hurts. Do you feel it? I think we should leave it alone. I don't know what it is. I mean, it's cool, don't get me wrong, and thank you for showing it to us. But what if it's poisonous or something?" said Macklin. "All the more reason we need to get rid of it," Greg said. It pulsed again and shuddered under the stress of the damage that it had withstood from Greg's shoe. Colin could feel it. Its presence was made of pain and soreness, a putrid, disgusting, tight, miserable tenderness that only more pain could destroy. He wanted desperately to rip it out of the earth's poor body, and it needed to be removed, whatever it was, and some deep instinct within him was screaming at him to do so. "Isn't it just going to keep regenerating?" Macklin asked. "It regenerates faster than I can pick at it, but if all of us are picking at it, then I think we can pick it all the way off before it has time to regenerate." "That's a good idea," Colin said. Macklin looked at Colin in disbelief. "I think you should do this in the morning," Macklin said. "No," Greg said. He took his hands out of his pockets, and the others saw that they were covered in something. Gloves, maybe. It looked like hundreds of smaller versions of the bump in front of them coated the entirety of his hands up to his wrists. It was a sea of individual warts rubbing through and against each other, creating a long, solid skin layer of rough growth. Hard, wiggling, moaning warts were cracking around his palms and fingers and deconstructing his skin. His knuckles split open, and his hands were falling apart as he reached down and grabbed 2 fistfuls of the excruciating life form. Soon, Colin found himself digging into the mixture as well. The hard shell of it broke open upon impact with his determined claws and released a terrible chutney of porous flesh underneath. It was an enormous wart threatening the very woods it was attempting to call home. A loud flashlight beam crashed through the cracks in the trees behind them as Dane emerged from the woods. "What the hell is that thing?" he said. "I don't know, but they want to pick it out of the ground," said Macklin. "Oh my God, Greg, your hands are disgusting. What happened? Stop touching that thing." Dane hurried over to the 2 men. The flashlight glared an aggressive wake-up call to Colin's eyes, and he was pulled from his daze. He backed away from the loathsome wart and he threw up. He rubbed his arms and hands into the dirt to cleanse the disgusting material from his skin. Overwhelming fear obscured his consciousness, and he scratched his hands along the rocks and dry land until they were bloody and any infected layers had been removed. "We did it," Greg said, as he dropped the last handful of wart tissue to the ground. A crater sat staring up at them, surrounded by the dead remnants of its former body. Hard, sharp edges struggled to create new warts, and it rattled and died. "Now we have to burn all of this." "We're not carrying that stuff back to camp," Dane said, "and we're definitely not starting a fire out here without someone from the Park Service being present. We could burn the whole woods down." "We have to," said Greg. "Your hands are messed up, Greg, and you pissed yourself. Look at you," Dane said. "I'm taking you back to camp. Let's go." Dane grabbed Greg's arm. Macklin blinked, and Dane was suddenly on his back with Greg on top of him, pinning his shoulders to the forest with his knees, while a drop beer bottle bled a fizzled ale beside them. Greg grabbed Dane's face with his bumpy, agonizingly wart-coated hands. The warts on his fingertips found their way into Dane's mouth and scraped against his front teeth. "We have to burn it." Greg stood up and Dane hopped to his feet, spitting. "I'm getting a park ranger. You're being ridiculous, dude." Dane and Macklin helped Colin to his feet, and they left. At the lodge, the 3 men asked the Lone Ranger on duty for the evening if she had ever seen any kind of growth that resembled their friend's obsession. She asked them if they had taken any sort of hallucinogenic drugs, and then asked if they had taken any drugs of any kind, and then she shook her head and agreed to drive them back to camp. When they returned, Colin was the first to start crying. In that clearing, where the stars had bestowed the power of their blessing, lay a shriveled body next to a smoldering pile of ashes. The stench of burning flesh slowly venting from the area put the ranger in a fit as she covered her nose and gagged. She informed them that they weren't supposed to set fires anywhere except for the designated areas at camping sites before she called for a medical team. The men agreed and informed her that Greg wouldn't listen. He needed to burn it. She took a bottle of water from the glove compartment of her truck and doused the final fading memory of the fire, which released a vociferous exhale of smoke. A puff of ash choked out of the hollow Wart crater, and she stomped the smoldering out with her boot and covered it in soil. Doctors later claimed that Greg died of smoke inhalation. They wouldn't say anything more beyond that, although they always looked like they wanted to. Greg's parents said they saw the x-rays of his lungs and thought they appeared riddled with tumors, bumps, or warts. His lungs were saturated in warts. The 3 men and the park ranger were given inhalers with a particular tasting medication they were told was for smoke inhalation and kept overnight for observation. They bandaged Colin's hands and tended to the early signs of newly emerging warts around Dane's mouth. The night was eerily quiet. The doctors had never seen warts on lungs before. They didn't know how to tell them about it. When Macklin returned with the park ranger to retrieve their camping gear the following day, they found the forest entrance blocked from public access. They ducked under the caution tape, walked a few yards, and stopped. Shaking, he removed his inhaler from his pocket and he ran. The park ranger soon followed. Behind them, slowly fading into the past, all the trees and birds, animals, fish, bushes, flowers, grass ponds, campsites, the ranger station, everything, all of it, all the wonders of that ravishing park, even the air, it was all covered in warts. The Beast in the Cave by H.P. Lovecraft. The horrible conclusion, which had been gradually obtruding itself upon my confused and reluctant mind, was now an awful certainty. I was lost, completely, hopelessly lost in the vast and labyrinthine recesses of the Mammoth Cave. Turn as I might, in no direction could my straining vision seize on any object capable of serving as my guidepost to set me on the outward path. That never more should I behold the blessing of the light of day, or scan the pleasant hills and dales of the beautiful world outside. My reason could no longer entertain the slightest unbelief. Hope had departed, yet indoctrinated as I was by a life of philosophical study, I derived no small measure of satisfaction from my unimpassioned demeanor. For although I had frequently read of the wild frenzies into which were thrown victims of similar situations, I experienced none of these, but stood quiet as soon as I clearly realized the loss of my bearings. Nor did the thought that I had probably wandered beyond the utmost limits of an ordinary search cause me to abandon my composure even for a moment. If I must die, I reflected, then was this terrible yet majestic cavern as welcome a sepulchre as that which any churchyard might afford, a conception which carried with it more of tranquility than of despair. Starving would prove my ultimate fate. Of this I was certain. Some, I knew, had gone mad under circumstances such as these, but I felt that this sin would not be mine. My disaster was the result of no fault save my own, since unbeknown to the guide, I had separated myself from the regular party of sightseers, and, wandering for over an hour in forbidden avenues of the cave, had found myself unable to retrace the devious windings which I had pursued since forsaking my companions. Already my torch had begun to expire, and soon I would be enveloped by the total and almost palpable blackness of the bowels of the earth. As I stood in the waning, unsteady light, I idly wondered over to the exact circumstances of my coming end. I remembered the accounts which I had heard of the colony of consumptives, who, taking their residence in this gigantic grotto to find health from the apparently salubrious air of the underground world with its steady, uniform temperature, pure air, and peaceful quiet, had found instead death in strange and ghastly form. I had seen the sad remains of their ill-made cottages as I passed by them with the party, and had wondered what unnatural influence a long sojourn in this immense and silent cavern would exert upon one as healthy and as vigorous as I. Now, I grimly told myself, my opportunity for settling this point had arrived, provided that want of food should not bring me too speedy a departure from this life. As the last fitful rays of my torch faded into obscurity, I resolved to leave no stone unturned, no possible means of escape neglected, so summoning all the powers possessed in my lungs, I set up a series of loud shoutings, in the vain hope of attracting the attention of the guide by my clamor. Yet, as I called, I believed in my heart that my cries were to no purpose, and that my voice, magnified and reflected by the numberless rampart of the black maze about me, fell upon no ears save my own. All at once, however, my attention was fixed with a start, as I fancied that I heard the sound of soft approaching steps on the rocky floor of the cavern. Was my deliverance about to be accomplished so soon? Had then all my horrible apprehensions been for naught, and was the guide, having marked my unwarranted absence from the party, following my course and seeking me out in this limestone labyrinth? While these joyful queries arose in my brain, I was on the point of renewing my cries in order that my discovery might come the sooner, when in an instant my delight was turned to horror as I listened, for my ever-acute ear, now sharpened in even greater degree by the complete silence of the cave, bore to my benumbed understanding the unexpected and dreadful knowledge that these footfalls were not like those of any mortal man. In the unearthly stillness of this subterranean region, the tread of the booted guide would have sounded like a series of sharp and incisive blows. These impacts were soft and stealthy, as of the padded paws of some feline. Besides, at times when I listened carefully, I seemed to trace the falls of 4 instead of 2 feet. I was now convinced that I had by my cries aroused and attracted some wild beast, perhaps a mountain lion which had accidentally strayed within the cave, and perhaps I considered the Almighty had chosen me a swifter and more merciful death than that of hunger. Yet the instinct of self-preservation, never wholly dormant, was stirred in my breast, and though escape from the oncoming peril might but spare me for a sterner and more lingering end, I determined nevertheless to part with my life at as high a price as I could command. Strange as it may seem, my mind conceived of no intent on the part of the visitor save that of hostility. Accordingly, I became very quiet, in the hope that the unknown beast would, in the absence of a guiding sound, lose its direction, as had I, and thus pass by me. But this hope was not destined for realization, for the strange footfalls steadily advanced, and the animal, evidently having obtained my scent, which in an atmosphere so absolutely free from all distracting influence as that of a cave, could doubtless be followed at great distance. Seeing, therefore, that I must be armed for defense against an uncanny and unseen attack in the dark, I groped about me the largest of the fragments of rock which were strewn upon all parts of the floor of the cavern in the vicinity, and grasping one in each hand for immediate use, I awaited the resignation of the inevitable result. Meanwhile, the hideous pattering of the paws drew near. And certainly the conduct of the creature was exceedingly strange. Most of the time the tread seemed to be that of a quadruped, walking with a singular lack of unison betwixt hind and fore feet, yet at brief and infrequent intervals I fancied that but 2 feet were engaged in the process of locomotion. I wondered what species of animal was to confront me. It must, I thought, be some unfortunate beast who had paid for its curiosity to investigate one of the entrances of the fearful grotto, with a lifelong confinement in its interminable recesses. It doubtless obtained as food the eyeless fish, and bats and rats of the cave, as well as some of the ordinary fish that were wafted in at every fish net of the Green River, which communicates in some occult manner with the waters of the cave. I occupied my terrible vigil with grotesque conjectures of what altercations cave life might have wrought in the physical structure of the beast, remembering the awful appearances ascribed by local tradition to the consumptives who had died after long residence in the cavern. And then I remembered with a start that even should I succeed in killing my antagonist, I should never behold its form, as my torch had long since been extinct, and I was entirely unprovided with matches. The tension on my brain now became frightful. My disordered fancy conjured up hideous and fearsome shapes from the sinister darkness that surrounded me, and that actually seemed to press upon my body. Nearer and nearer the dreadful footfalls approached. It seemed that I must give vent to a piercing scream, yet had I been sufficiently irresolute to attempt such a thing, my voice could scarce have responded. I was petrified and rooted to the spot. I doubted if my right arm would allow me to hurl its missile at the oncoming thing when the crucial moment should arrive. And now the steady pat-pat of the steps was close at hand. Now they were very close. I could hear the labored breathing of the animal, and terror-struck as I was, I realized that it must have come from a considerable distance and was correspondingly fatigued. Suddenly the spell broke. My right hand, guided by my ever-trustworthy sense of hearing, threw with full force the sharp-angled bit of limestone which it contained toward that point in the darkness from which emanated the breathing and pattering. And wonderful to relate, it nearly reached its goal, for I heard the thing jump, landing at a distance away, where it seemed to pause. Having readjusted my aim, I discharged my second missile, this time most effectively, for with a flood of joy I listened as the creature fell in what sounded like a complete collapse, and evidently remained prone and unmoving. Almost overpowered by the great relief which rushed over me, I reeled back against the wall. The breathing continued in heavy, gasping inhalations and expirations, whence I realized that I had no more than wounded the creature. And now all desire to examine the thing ceased. At last something allied to groundless superstitious fear had entered my brain, and I did not approach the body, nor did I continue to cast stones at it in order to complete the extinction of its life. Instead, I ran at full speed in what was, as nearly as I could determine in my frenzied condition, the direction from which I had come. Suddenly I heard a sound, or rather a regular succession of sounds. In another instant they had resolved themselves into a series of sharp metallic clicks. This time there was no doubt. It was the guide. And then I shouted and yelled and screamed. I even shrieked with joy as I beheld the vaulted arches above the faint light, which I knew to be the reflected light of an approaching torch. I ran to meet the flare, and before I could completely understand what had occurred, was lying upon the ground at the feet of the guide, embracing his boots and gibbering, despite my boasted reserve, in a most meaningless and idiotic manner, pouring out my terrible story, and at the same time overwhelming my auditor with protestations of gratitude. After a while, I awoke to something like my normal consciousness. The guide had noted my absence upon the arrival of the party at the entrance of the cave, and had, from his own intuitive sense of direction, proceeded to make a thorough canvass of the by-passages just ahead of where he had last spoken to me, locating my whereabouts after a quest of about 4 hours. By the time he had related this to me, I, emboldened by his torch and his company, began to reflect upon the strange beast which I had wounded but a short distance back in the darkness, and suggested that we ascertain by the light's aid what manner of creature was my victim. Accordingly, I retraced my steps, this time with the courage born of companionship, to the scene of my terrible experience. And soon we descried a white object upon the floor, an object whiter even than the gleaming limestone itself. Cautiously advancing, we gave vent to a simultaneous projection of wonderment, for of all the unnatural monsters either of us had in our lifetimes beheld, this was in surpassing degree the strangest. It appeared to be an anthropod ape of large proportions, escaped perhaps from some internment menagerie. Its hair was snow white, a thing due no doubt to bleaching action of a long existence within the inky confines of the cave, but it was also surprisingly thin, being indeed largely absent save on the head, where it was of such length and abundance that it fell over the shoulders in considerable profusion. The face was turned away from us, as the creature lay almost directly upon it. The inclination of the limbs was very singular, explaining, however, the alternation in their use which I before noted, whereby the beast used sometimes all 4, and on other occasions but 2 for its progress. From the tips of the fingers or toes, long nail-like claws extended. The hands or feet were not prehensile. In fact, I ascribed that to long residence in the cave, which, as I before mentioned, seemed evident from the all-pervading, almost unearthly whiteness, so characteristic of the whole anatomy. No tail seemed to be present. The respiration had now grown feeble, and the guide had drawn his pistol with the evident intent of dispatching the creature, when a sudden sound emitted by the latter caused the weapon to fall unused. The sound was of a nature difficult to describe. It was not like the normal note of any known species of simian, and I wondered if this unnatural quality were not the result of a long-continued and complete silence, broken by the sensations produced by the advent of the light, a thing which the beast could not have seen since its first entrance into the cave. The sound, which I might feebly attempt to classify as a kind of deep-toned chattering, was faintly continued. All at once fleeting spasms of energy seemed to pass through the frame of the beast, and the paws went through a convulsive motion, and the limbs contracted, and with a jerk the white body rolled over so that its face was turned in our direction. And for a moment I was so struck with horror at the eyes thus revealed that I noted nothing else. They were black, those eyes deep jetty black, in hideous contrast to the snow-white hair and flesh. Like those of other cave denizens, they were deeply sunken in their orbits and were entirely destitute of iris. As I looked more closely, I saw that they were set in a face less than that of the average ape and infinitely more hairy. The nose was quite distinct. As we gazed upon the uncanny sight presented to our vision, the thick lips opened and several sounds issued from them, after which the thing relaxed in death. The guide clutched my coat sleeve and trembled so violently that the light shook fitfully, casting weird moving shadows on the walls about us. I made no motion, but stood rigidly still, my horrified eyes fixed upon the floor ahead. And then fear left, and wonder and awe and compassion and reverence succeeded in its place, for the sounds uttered by the stricken figure that lay stretched out on the limestone had told us the awesome truth. The creature I had killed, the strange beast of the unfathomed cave, was, or had at one time been, a man.